This man feeds an underweight lynx for several months in defiance of everyone else's advice. A few months after their initial meeting, the lynx gives him back an unexpected and shocking gift. John was in the cabin he had hired out to escape the hustle and bustle of the city and find comfort in the serene, quiet woodland. He'd liked going on hikes in the woods forever. The man dressed in his hiking gear started out this morning. He prepared everything he would need, including a medium-sized blanket in case he stayed out late and became cold, along with a bottle of water and a pair of binoculars. Naturally, he was unaware at the time of how useful it would be, and he had no idea that his day would go in a completely unexpected and surprising manner. The hike was blissfully uneventful and smooth at first. It was far better than John had imagined. However, somewhere along the way, he saw an unsettling scene that completely shocked him. He had been enjoying the landscape and strolling quickly when he heard a muffled moan from nearby. When John heard the whimpering once more, he changed his mind from initially believing he was hallucinating. It sounded like whatever or whoever it was in anguish this time, and it was louder. Persuaded that there may be someone injured and requesting assistance, John made a quick diversion and began listening carefully to locate the faint sound of whimpers. It took him a few minutes to trace down the source of the sound. A little animal sat snugly at the base of a huge tree. John approached the beast warily and curiously, anxiety and concern racing through his body. Because of the way its body was hunched and wrapped, perhaps in an attempt to stay warm, he was initially unable to identify what it was. He could now see that he was approaching a lynx, most likely not more than a few months old. The small cub's body shivered with weakness, and its fur was matted and soiled. The sight devastated his heart. With tears in his eyes, John collapsed onto his knees next to the cub. The poor thing was barely hanging on to life, its ribs sticking out sharply beneath the paper-thin skin. It was an absolutely horrifying sight. John extended his hand cautiously. He paused, but his heart was telling him to go ahead. Naturally, the cub startled at first, but it seems to recognize that John was not there to add to its already excruciating misery. The cub reluctantly relaxed and met John's gaze with a mixture of tentative trust and trepidation. John reached for his water bottle and poured some water into his hand without pausing. Holding the water in his hands, he presented it to the lynx and observed as it eagerly gulped it down. Then he took out the blanket he was carrying and covered the cub in it with care. It made sense that the creature would be shivering and crying in agony given its thin skin and stringy hair. Given that the cub was obviously in such desperate need of assistance, he realized he couldn't just leave it out here on its own. The cub seemed to have more faith in John now, and he took the cub into his arms and held it to his breast with gentle care. John was shocked by how light and feeble the cub was, which only served to highlight how urgent the issue was. He was concerned that a single mistake may do the animal harm or possibly crush it because it felt so delicate in his grasp. Nevertheless, John felt reassured that he was acting appropriately by the shallow breathing and the constant pounding of his heart against his hand. This youngster was struggling for its life, and he would stop at nothing to keep himself alive. John wrapped the blanket closer around the cub and spoke softly to it while he walked gingerly back to his hut. He'd gone fast and wild on the way there, leaping and jumping where he could, but the return trip was different. He was overwhelmed by this sudden and unfamiliar responsibility, knowing that a life depended on him. He eventually arrived to the cabin after hiking through the forest for an hour and a half. Upon entering, John placed the cub on a plush blanket and observed as it coiled itself into a snug ball in search of warmth and solace. He filled a dish with water and held it out to the cub, his hands shaking. Its thirst slaked, it licked greedily at the water, yet its hunger persisted. John rummaged through his supplies, looking for something to feed the cub, determined to do whatever it takes to help it. Finally, he discovered a tuna can stashed away in the rear of his pantry. A relic from a long-ago camping excursion. John opened the can carefully, took out a tiny bit of tuna, and gave it to the cub. It sniffed at the food, a little hesitantly at first. But then, its small jaws working frantically, it started to consume the pieces with a desire that almost seemed desperate. John had a rush of hope mixed with a deep sense of duty as he watched the youngster feed, though he was aware that this was only the start of a lengthy trip. He was committed to seeing it through to the finish, no matter the cost. He sat there in the low light of the cabin, ears ringing with the sound of the lynx cub purring contentedly. It was evident to John that his life would never be the same. John continued to care for the cub, who turned out to be female, for the following few weeks. Every day he fed her, gave her water, and each evening he let her go, though he was certain the cub would finally return to the forest and never come back. He was nevertheless astonished every day to see her hobbling back to the cabin as if it were her home. When John contacted his family and friends back home to report what had happened, it made him feel proud. Everyone yelled at him, horrified, pleading with him to get rid of the lynx or flee as quickly as possible. However, he was aware that, in his opinion, he was connected to the lynx in a unique way. Her eyes, which were a striking yellow, inspired him to name her Bambi. As the months went by, he became more and more proud, but a melancholy also simmered within of him. Bambi grew more self-reliant as well as stronger and healthier with every day that went by. The brittle frame has transformed into a muscular, sleek one with a shimmering golden coat. On certain days, she returned with something. Being an expert hunter now, Bambi would return with dead rats to give to her companion. Despite the fact that it was a little strange, he still enjoyed it and kept feeding and tending to her. But John realized it was time to part ways with Bambi as the days stretched into weeks. She was a wild animal designed to wander freely in the great forest, not a weak, malnourished cub in need of his care. John packed everything and headed into the woods one morning, filled with sorrow. Bambi, not unexpectedly, meekly trailed along with him. After a few minutes of walking, they came to a clearing where John bent down next to the lynx. At last he bid farewell, his voice stifled with sentiment. Saying farewell was difficult, and it seems that the lynx understood as well. She put her head to his forehead, and he got up and went away slowly. John knew he would never forget the lynx cub, even though he had left the jungle and gone home a few weeks after that heartbreaking farewell. He would always remember Bambi since they would never again cross paths, and Bambi had made an enduring impression on his heart. It wasn't as he had envisioned it, but he couldn't have been more mistaken. A year or so later, John was bleeding and hurt when he was discovered laying in a ditch. Nothing can top this horrible day, John thought to himself as he lay there in the mud, bleeding out. John had had bad days before. In fact, he was used to them. As blood seeped from the wound on his thigh, the excruciating pain overwhelmed every thought he had. He was surrounded by a dark, stifling forest, but luckily, or unfortunately, his senses were too numbed by terror and agony. The fact that he believed he knew these forests like the back of his hand startled him even more. He had only moved here a few months prior, so he hadn't expected any difficulties. Only hours earlier he had been joyfully and securely trekking. John's day took a dramatic turn just 1 hour into his trek, when he came onto a steep slope. At that point he lost his balance and fell into the undergrowth, scuffing over a number of pebbles and sticks, until ultimately coming to rest at the foot of a rocky outcrop. He was brutally struck by the fall, twisting and shattering as a result. During his fall, he had met sharp branches and jagged rocks, which had not been kind to him. He had been left wounded and bleeding with gashes all over his body. He was certain he had twisted his ankle or worse when he yelled in agony as he attempted to move. A deep growl broke the stillness as John lay there, barely cognizant, and jolted him back to a semi-aware state. Was this a rogue animal that had detected the scent of his blood? Was this the last he would see? The idea of being attacked by a wild animal made John wince, but nothing could have prepared him for the terrifying sight of the lynx charging toward him. He well recalled Bambi, the lynx he had gotten to know years prior, but there was no way of knowing for sure that this was the same lynx. He didn't think a lynx would remember him and then decide not to eat him, even if that was the case. True, he and Bambi had a unique affinity, but even an optimist like him would have been overly optimistic to predict such a fortuitous encounter. John lay there, gasping for air in ragged breaths, frozen in fear, waiting for the impending onslaught. To his surprise, though, the onslaught never materialized. Rather, he sensed something moist and warm nuzzling up against his neck, and for a split second, he dared to dream that perhaps, just possibly, he wouldn't pass away that day. The lynx put its head to his forehead, giving him the impression that she was greeting him. John was in complete disbelief. His jaw dropped wide. A wave of incredulity passed over John as he cautiously and slowly lifted his good hand to caress the plush fur of this unexpected savior. She was the one, Bambi, his adult lynx cub, still very much his companion, but as savage as ever. John's voice was clogged with passion as he uttered her name, tears stinging at the corners of his eyes, and Bambi, as though in reply, leaned her forehead against his, her comfort spoken in silence, a salve to his broken heart. Bambi gave John's jacket hood a light pull, sending a quiet message that it was time to leave. John let himself be pulled from the ditch, gritting his teeth against the agony. He fell in and out of consciousness for a long, painful journey, but when he eventually came to, he was surrounded by a gathering of confused observers, their eyes wide with incredulity. Someone exclaimed incredulously, "Did that lynx just drag him to the side of the road?" John couldn't help but smile a little as he fell back into the warm embrace of darkness. Weeks went by, and John's wounds gradually got better, but he would never forget Bambi's courage. He regretted that he would never get to say goodbye to her, but if their chance meeting was any indication, she still remembered and loved him in the same way that he did. All healed and feeling much better, John looked out at the wide expanse of the landscape in front of him as he sat on his veranda back home. He was overcome with thankfulness for the strange relationship that had saved his life. What a lovely tale of friendship. Have you and a wild animal ever bonded? Tell us in the comments what your favorite portion of the story is. I'll see you in the upcoming video.